Hello, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on our leaders, where we will be covering all of the major world leaders in the year of 2020. Today we will be covering Muhammadu Buhari, the president of Nigeria, and Alberto Fernandez, the president of Argentina. So without further ado, we will begin with Buhari. So President Buhari is a Nigerian politician, currently the president of Nigeria since 2015. He is a retired military general of the Nigerian army, and in fact he was actually head of state previously for a period from 1983 to 1985 after a coup d'etat, a military coup. So interesting to see him on both sides of the political landscape, as being an elected leader and at one point being essentially a dictator. He's considered to be the leader of Buharism, which is named after him. His last name is Buhari, which is manifested or evidenced by conservative right-wing policies and sort of representative of his military regime and military past. He takes full responsibility before fully delving into his early life, but he does take full responsibility for his military actions during the coup and as head of state. So, and once again, for all of these videos, I'm trying to give the most positive spin I can on all of these individuals, because I think it's much easier for you to find the negative aspects about all these individuals, but these videos are more to be sort of instructive and educational in terms of instilling leadership qualities within yourself. So, and he's considered to be a converted Democrat, so completely switched over. You may believe it or you may not believe it, but nonetheless, he is generally considered to be some respected individual, both within his own country, that being Nigeria, and in the global international landscape. He, additionally, to sort of evidence this, he ran unsuccessfully for president in 2003, 2007, and 2011 in general elections. So this proves that obviously he does respect the election processes of Nigeria and isn't just going into full military force once again. In December of 2014, he ran as a candidate for the All Progressive Congress for the March 2015 elections, where he beat the incumbent president Goodluck Jonathan, and this was the first time in Nigerian history where an incumbent lost to an opposition candidate in an actual general election. So it's actually, although he might be representative of the some of the military difficulties in the country, he also could be a good representative of the shift towards democratic processes. But he won again in February of 2019, so he is, as of today, still the president of Nigeria, and he beat his closest rival, Atiku Abubakar, by 3 million votes, which sounds like a lot of votes. However, the country has 159.9 million people, so actually a pretty close margin. But nonetheless, we'll go to his early life and we'll talk more about his actual policies and a little bit more about his actual election process. So he was born to a Fulani family in December of 1942. The Fulani are one of the largest ethnic groups in the West African continent. There's about 30 to 40 million Fulani individuals. They are not one of the largest ethnic groups in Nigeria. I think that's important to note. Even if all the Fulani were in Nigeria, they still wouldn't even make up a quarter of the full population of Nigeria. But nonetheless, they're distributed throughout West Africa, however. About a third, between 12 and 15 million of the Fulani peoples are pastoralists, so they are largely nomadic, and they are actually the largest nomadic community in the world. So, and about 46% of the Fulani are Muslim. So, in effect, Buhari is a Muslim, a Sunni Muslim, more specifically. Nigeria is predominantly Sunni Muslim as well, and we'll see that he has had some, I would say, malpractices with respect to Shia within his own country. But it's also important to note that within Nigeria, the north is predominantly Muslim. However, the south, being a formerly British colony, is actually predominantly Christian as well. But I think to sort of encapsulate all of this, he did not come from one of the three major ethnic groups in Nigeria, that being firstly the Hansa, secondly the Igbo, and thirdly the Yoruba. So he came from a third larger ethnic group. However, he did come from a religious majority within the country, which could help. But I think we could consider him to be somewhat of an outsider, but not completely. But also, it must be noted that, well, firstly, the Fulani all share the Fula language. However, they have actually fared pretty well, although the nomadic people are quite deep into poverty and have quite a substantial amount of hardships. They perform pretty well in the political landscape. For example, the president of Senegal, Macky Sall, is Fulani. The president of Gambia, Adama Barrow, is also Fulani. The vice president of Sierra Leone, Mohamed Jallow, is also Fulani. The prime minister of Mali, Babou Sis, Fulani. Deputy secretary general of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, is also Fulani. The president-elect of the UN General Assembly, Tijani Muhammad Bande, is also Fulani. And lastly, the Secretary General of OPEC, Mohammed Surusi Barkindo, is also Fulani. So nonetheless, despite them being a somewhat smaller group, they tend to, it seems as though they fare quite well in politics or in achieving positions of power. Perhaps not to drive too many conclusions, but I think coming from a nomadic lifestyle, they are I think one could consider tougher in character. Nomadic peoples, obviously today everything's getting a lot more mixed, but nomadic peoples historically have had, they have to be lactose tolerant because most commonly they eat their livestock and they drink the milk of their livestock, which tends to yield them slightly stronger, as seen with, for example, Genghis Khan in his conquering of East Asia. Part of it was, firstly, they were nomadic, so they could ride their horses, but they were also, particularly compared to the Han Dynasty, which was predominantly on a rice-based diet, the Mongols were not only riding horses, but they were also physically a lot stronger because they were lactose tolerant and drinking a lot of milk. But nonetheless, this is a little bit of an extrapolation, but I think the Fulani people are physically quite strong, and I think that also has reflected into their some of their political pursuits as well. Some background about Nigeria, if you don't know, firstly, the population is 159.9 million, making it the largest country in Africa by population. It's actually, or debatably has 206 million people, but the more correct estimate is probably 159.9 million people. But there, as mentioned, there are a lot of Fulani who are, for example, nomadic and some up to dispute, but nonetheless, it's the largest country in Africa, in the 7th largest by population in the world. But interestingly enough, it has the 3rd largest youth population in the world after India and China. So it has a population of 90 million under the age of 18. So almost half of the population, or even more than half of the population, are below the age of 18. What does this mean in the future? It'll probably rise in the ranks in terms of largest countries by population, as some of the older countries, their older population dies off, sadly, one might say, but Nigeria will probably move into the 3rd spot, maybe even higher, depending on how other countries, such as if China maintains a one-China policy or further implements something of that sort. But nonetheless, it's a very, very large country by population. It's got about 250 ethnic groups, Fulani being one of them, over 500 languages. The largest ethnic groups are, as mentioned, Hansa, firstly, then secondly, Igbo, and thirdly, Yoruba. The actual official language of Nigeria is English, being formerly a English colony, and considering there are 500 languages, it's just generally a good median for them to communicate in. So Buhari was born in Dora, which is in North Africa, which is the more Muslim region in Katsina State. The Actually, the University of California African American Studies Department says that the ancient seat of Islamic culture is actually in this region, the Katsina state capital, Katsina, as well as Daro, so as well as Islamic culture and learning. So very religious place, and so he would have been considered well in the majority, at least from a belief standpoint. And it's the spiritual home of the Hausa people, which is the largest ethnic majority in Nigeria. However, Buhari doesn't necessarily come from this group, or he does not at all. His father, Buhari's father, Malum Halo Adama, was a Fulani chieftain, so pretty powerful within that group. And Buhari was actually his 23rd child, his father's 23rd child, so a very prolific breeder, we might call him. His mother was Zulaihat, and he was predominantly raised by his mother, as his father died when he was 4 years old. And even hypothetically, if he had lived to Buhari's later years, being his 23rd child, I don't think he would have got a lot of attention. But nonetheless, his mother, he's very close with his mother, and actually, as we'll see, that's one of the reasons why he ultimately gets released from prison. He went to primary school in Dara, and he also spent a brief time in Meadua second primary school. He continued on to Katsina Middle School, to Katsina Provincial Secondary School, and he graduated in he was at this high school in Katsina Secondary School from 1956 to 1961, and graduated when he was 19 years old. So a pretty actually standard education, not only for the wealthier people in Nigeria, but globally. And even today, it's very common for people to graduate between 18 and 19 years old. After graduation, he joined the Nigerian Military Training College, which is one of the two first military universities in Nigeria. However, the first and elder one does not actually have the military training, like the physical training, so it would be considered the first physical military training university. And did he choose it for this reason? Perhaps he's a more physically intense person, or perhaps it was just perchance that he ended up there. But nonetheless, he got physical military training as well as tactical training there. In 1964, the school was upgraded and renamed the Nigerian Defense Academy. In 1962 to 1963, he underwent cadet training in Mons Officer Cadet School in Aldershot, England, so 20 to 21 years old. So this proves a couple things. Firstly, his English must have been sufficiently good to enroll in training in the United Kingdom, and similarly, at a pretty young age, he had got to see much of the world, whereas many other people would not have had that opportunity. Specifically, Fulani, who are nomadic, where although they moved a lot throughout the country, they did not quite get the opportunities to go and study cadet training in the United Kingdom. So obviously a very great opportunity for him. In 1963, he was commissioned second lieutenant and appointed to a platoon commander of the 2nd Infantry Battalion in Abeokuta, Nigeria, at 20 years old after his training. So very young to have a quite substantial leadership role. He was at least had at least 15 people under his supervision. So obviously, I think he definitely had not only the right education, but I think he had inherent leadership qualities, and people were not only his superiors wanted to choose him to lead, but also the people below him respected him as a leader. As well, he became a platoon commander. He took the platoon commander's course at the Nigerian Military Training College in Kaduna. So he always considered his education quite important, and he continued to study and study and study. In 1964, he further facilitated his training at the Mechanical Transport Officers course at the Army Mechanical Transport School in Borden, United Kingdom as well. So further but more from a technical stance. And as we'll see during the coup, this technical and mechanical training came into very important use for his ultimate rise to absolute power. In 1965 to 1967, he became commander of the 2nd Infantry Battalion, and from April to July of 1967, he became brigade major, the 1st Infantry Division, so continuing to rise in the ranks and obviously evidencing good leadership qualities. At this time, the Civil War broke out, and during the Civil War, he rose quickly to leadership as he allied with Yakuba Gowon in the counter coup. So during the Civil War, Akuyi Ironsi essentially did the first coup and came into as head of state of Nigeria, and he aligned with a counter coup in this case and overthrew them and gained him a lot of power and also rose quickly through the ranks in military. He proved himself to be quite a strategic military tactician at this point, whereas rather than swift approaches and swift advances upon the enemies, he held onto communication networks and maintained the food supply. In fact, he gave a lot of loss. One could call it a Pyrrhic victory if you see the video I created on Pure Hus, where a victory is won but at a great cost. So in fighting off to defend the food supplies, they maintained the food supplies in many cases but lost many individuals. But had the food supplies fell into enemy hands, perhaps their case would have been altogether lost. Similarly, he used towns that had been captured and towns that they were protecting to be training facilities for incoming recruits and incoming soldiers. So ultimately led to the victory in the counter coup and gained him a lot of notoriety within the army and within the nation as a whole. Another comparison besides Pyrrhus, I think we could most closely compare him to is Quintus Maximus Fabius Veracos, or just Fabius, as I created a video on. He's known, Veracos is actually to distinguish him from his family because he had a wart on his face. However, Veracos is known as the Conctator in his fights against Hannibal, where he was essentially what's considered to be the founder of guerrilla warfare tactics. And guerrilla warfare tactics involve not engaging the enemy straight on, but winning sort of micro battles and sort of specifically in Veracos's case, or Fabius's case, holding back attacks, especially with Hannibal at the time had a much larger army. So we could consider him a great guerrilla warfare tactician and a comparable to Fabius as well there. And as well, Pyrrhus, as he's willing to suffer losses for a larger victory. So a great military tactician, obviously helped him gain and rise. After the war in 1970 to 1971, when he was only 28 years old to 29 years old, he was assigned to Brigade Major Commandant in the 31st Infantry Brigade. And in 1971 to 1972, he became Assistant Adjutant General to the 1st Infantry Division in headquarters. So an adjutant is essentially the main secretary of a leading individual. So he was a very, very important role, and now at headquarters, both through his great deal of military education, but also his evidenced ability to lead and win battles. In 1973, he joined the Defense Services Staff College in Wellington, India, so once again getting some more international experience. In 1974 to 1975, when he was 30 to 31 years old, he became Acting Director of Transport and Supply for the Army in the headquarters. So Transport and Supply, this is all coming back to his education. He took the mechanical training courses, which obviously showed a lot of forethought from his perspective in knowing that ultimately this would allow him to get such an important position. In 1978 to 1979, he became Military Secretary at the HQ and a member of the Supreme Military Council. In 1979 to 1980, he attained the rank of Colonel, the class of 1980, and attended the U.S. War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So a very, very important war college where many of the most important military generals in the United States hail their education from. More specifically as well, and an interesting parallel too, is El-Sisi, the president of Egypt, actually also went to this war college in Pennsylvania as well. So obviously very, very, very prestigious school to study at. You can study remotely or on campus there, and he actually studied on campus there for a full year, or for a full 10 months, and he also had 2 years distance learning program. So I think this would be his crown jewel in terms of his education, and obviously rendered him one of the most, at least, educated in terms of military tactics, but also I think through the past civil war, the most proven as well. Then ultimately his coup d'etat started, and which led to him becoming head of state. So in the 1983 coup, he was one of the major leaders and ultimately became the one to rule the country, where they overthrew the democratically elected president Shehu Shagari. At the start of it, he was general officer of commanding the 3rd Armored Division of the JOS. So once again, working with armored vehicles, coming back to his mechanical training, which showed him to be very pragmatic. And this led to the ending of the short Second Republic. So the Second Republic only lasted from the previous civil war up until this coup d'etat. And it was a multi-party democracy starting in 1979. And he has this famous quote here, and I don't like to jump too early into the quotes, but I'll say it here nonetheless. A flawed democracy is worse than no democracy at all. So that was sort of his logic behind this. He saw the old democracy as corrupt and saw that he should take full control. In 1984, Buhari passed a decree number 4, the Protection Against False Accusations Decree, which many academics consider to be the most repressive decree in all of Nigerian history. What it involved was anyone who spoke out against the government could be imprisoned for up to 2 years and a minimum of 10,000 naira fine. So very, very repressive. I think even no matter what the press has to say, they should have the right to say it. One of my favorite quotes by Voltaire, who I also have a video on, which I'd highly recommend you watch. He says, "I disagree with what you say, but I will fight with my life for your right to say it," which I think is a very beautiful statement, but obviously something that Buhari did not believe at this time, and he believed in the persecution of those who thought differently or believed differently from him and his group. He only served, but it's still a substantial time. He was for 20 months as head of state, where he was ultimately jailed after this period. During this period, however, over 500 politicians, officials, and businessmen were also jailed due to said corruption, and likely many said killings also occurred. He was overthrown ultimately in 1985 by General Ibrahim Babangida. But interestingly, the supporters of Buhari say that the only reason that Buhari was overthrown was because the people who were overthrowing him, Babangida, were feared persecution themselves, which I don't think is necessarily a completely fair attack. However, the reason why the Ibrahim overthrew Buhari was not because he disagreed with his right to lead, Buhari's right to lead, but he just thought that he wasn't properly addressing the economic problems of the country. So didn't really outwardly denounce him, just said that he could do a better job, which is interesting, and I think ultimately led to Buhari coming back into power. So after 1985, he served 3 years in detention in a small guarded bungalow in Benin, where he was only allowed to watch 2 TV channels. I'm not sure what that was, but that's obviously, I guess, not ethical. But once again, he would persecute and censor people, so it seemed like he got censored during this period. But he was allowed visitors from his family through authorization through the government. However, after his mother's death, he was released and retired to his residence in Dora. So firstly, I think it was largely his relationship with his mother and the sympathy through the country that they let him get released. And I think it also, firstly, shows that a little bit of his compassion, but the country's partiality to him. I think they saw he still had goodness in him, and perhaps he had the capacity and ability to change. Right after he got released, however, he divorced his first wife and married a new individual named Aisha Halilu, pardon me, and he became the chairman of Foundation for Economic and Social Development in Katsina State. So interesting, I think at this point, his criticism, as he was military head of state, was that he did not address economic problems. So the first thing he does when he gets back into the real world outside of his house arrest, you could call it, he goes and tries to correct economic problems. So sort of working on his weaknesses, which I think is a sign of a good leader, or at least a pragmatic one, or one who's aware of their faults. He also became chairman of the Petroleum Trust Fund, the PTF, and achieved great success for them as well, and is considered to be a rare success story by the African journals. So he actually seemed to prove himself economically. After this, he ultimately became president. However, he was very persistent, as mentioned previously. He ran in 2003 and lost. He ran in 2007 and lost, and he ran in 2011 and lost, and he ultimately won in the 2015 elections. He was the candidate for the All Progressive Congress for the March 2015 elections, where he beat the incumbent president, as mentioned previously, Goodluck Jonathan, in the first time in Nigerian history where an incumbent had been democratically beaten, because throughout history and in his own previous case, it was done through a coup d'etat. So I guess one takeaway here is, though, although he did something I think quite wrong, I think a coup d'etat is not an ethical thing to do. The military should never seize control of the country. He was no different from all the previous leaders. No other leader had ever defeated an incumbent leader democratically. So although he was like the other people in the wrong sense, he did something very good and actually became the first one to democratically beat someone in the most fair boxing arena, we could call it. So I think that's props to him in that respect. And once again, he won again in the February 2019 election, beating his closest rival by 3 million votes, which is, I think, a pretty small margin, one could say, for such a large country as Nigeria. However, voting turnout is questionable because many of the people do not have access. His presidency has been marked by, he has improved GDP growth by 0.9% on average since he was elected in 2015, which is quite slow, and he's been criticized for it, but could another individual do better? It is hard to say in his defense. However, unemployment rates have been hitting record highs, as high as 24%, which is the highest of all time on record, though perhaps during the coup, any of the coups one could consider to be much, much higher. He has been criticized for for his unenergetic personality and his contemplative decision-making process. So I don't think these are necessarily bad things, but he's not exactly the charismatic leader that you might see in amongst populist leaders. He's not a great orator. He's very, as mentioned, unenergetic. But I think that might be sort of a backlash from his previous experiences being military leader. I don't think he wants to show himself to be too enthusiastic, and he's contemplative decision-making is better than irrational decision-making, so in his defense. He's been criticized for the Islamic movement of Nigeria, which is a Shia movement. So as mentioned, he is Sunni, and Nigeria is predominantly Sunni sect of Muslim in Nigeria. So he shelled the leader Sheikh Ibrahim Zakaki's base, where over hundreds were killed. After they accused this leader Zakaki for attacking the chief army officer Tukur Baradi, and they ultimately arrested the leader of the Shia group. However, is this just a religious intolerance, or was this a fair accusation against this Shia group and its leaders, Akaki? It's hard to say, but I don't think it's a step in the right direction. I think hundreds. I think the answers in the details, and hundreds died, I don't think can be justified, even though, like for example, Takur Burati, I don't know if he was actually directly affected by the leader of the Shia group, but I think at least we could say that Buhari's actions against this Shia group was too strong, and that in itself is wrong. It would be more wrong if it was based on religious grounds, but we do not know that entirely. But it seems a lot like it does, like a religious intolerance. With respect to Boko Haram, his strategy has been to split the group into two sects, and that has been largely successful. Now they're essentially defeated. Some notable events in 2016, he achieved the release of 21 Chibok girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram. As well, in 2017, he led to the release of 82 of the 276 kidnapped girls in exchange for some of the leaders of Boko Haram. So I think the takeaway here is that Buhari is willing to negotiate with terrorists, which could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. Going forward, Boko Haram might know they can if they want to achieve political gains, they can continue to kidnap girls, and perhaps Buhari has allowed for this. However, I think I empathize with Buhari. I think that to save these young girls is more important than letting free some of these war criminals. Obviously, these war criminals do deserve persecution, and they should try to catch them again. However, to save these girls is of the utmost importance, and I do support what he did. You know, that people say don't negotiate with terrorists. Yeah, sure, you should try to avoid negotiation with terrorists at all costs. But if there are kidnapped young girls, I think that is a cost worthy of some negotiation, and I don't think his negotiation went too far. And especially considering, once again, you can conclude his success based on the ultimate outcome. Boko Haram is essentially defeated and essentially no longer exists, so I think you could consider him to be correct. If Boko Haram was hitting all-time highs, then we might say, oh, okay, well, he allowed for this by negotiating with terrorists and freeing some of their individuals. In terms of some of his foreign policies, he has criticized the military crackdown by the Myanmar army and police on the Rohingya Muslim community, where he has considered it to be somewhat of a like the Rwandan genocide. I do think the actions against the army, against this Muslim sect, is unethical, and it is based on religious grounds. But once again, this could just be Buhari empathizing with his own Muslim sect. But just because you might not align with his reasoning, I think the overall message in that it is like the Rwandan genocide is true, and I don't think just because someone's reason you might differ from someone's reasonings doesn't mean you have to differ with their decision. In terms of South Africa, they've been having some disputes and negotiations because, well, firstly, between South Africa and Nigeria. South Africa is the richest country. Nigeria is the most populous country. They account for over 50% of the entire GDP of Africa. And Africa has many, many countries, and they're heavily consolidated. The GDP is heavily consolidated in these two countries. However, because Nigeria's economy has been not growing as fast at 0.9% and high unemployment rates, over 600,000 individuals have immigrated to South Africa. And particularly in 2008, 2015, after Buhari was elected, and in 2019, the immigrated Nigerians have been causing fights and violence with the original populations in South Africa, and this has caused some disputes and has caused for the necessity for negotiations between Buhari and the leadership of South Africa. but not necessarily. I don't think it's in any way his fault. It's not like he's whispering into some Nigerians' ears, go to South Africa and cause violence. I don't think that's at all. I think it just happens to be that the people who are fleeing the country are maybe not the best sample of individuals. And they've been subjected to poverty as well. And they went to South Africa to expect a better life, and perhaps that's not what they're receiving, and maybe they're receiving some intolerance. So maybe it's completely on the fault of South Africa as well. So there's always two sides of the coin, and I'm not too sure entirely which is the right one. And that's why I think Buhari's sort of got a generally neutral stance on this, and that's why I think negotiations are necessitated. In terms of his personal life, he has 5 children with his first wife, Safanada, who he married in 1971 after the Civil War, and he has 4 girls and 1 boy with her. However, 2 of the girls have died. One particularly in 2006 died from diabetes, or his previous wife died in 2006 from diabetes. However, after they had already divorced in 1988. In 1988, he took his second wife, whom he also has 5 children, and exactly the same ratio, 4 girls and 1 boy. I think interesting. I don't know. I think it's coincident. It's something of a coincidence that its ratio always seems to be 3 to 1, 4 girls to 1 boy. In terms of his assets, he says, and during his 2015 election, he has 150,000 USD cash, which is a very substantial amount for, especially considering some of the wealth gap in Nigeria. However, to be a former head of state and incumbent president, it's not too substantial. However, he has 5 homes, 2 mud houses, 270 head of cattle, 25 sheep, 5 horses, farms, 3 firms, and surprisingly only 2 cars. So, but I think his assets are definitely above 150,000 because he has 150,000 in cash. I think it would be safe to say, especially considering his capacity for military control. I think we could put him at least in the billions. Especially, I think he has a lot of relative power, and I think he does have Nigeria is now a democracy, and he has proven it by being the first fully democratic leader to beat an incumbent democratic leader. So I think it's evidence that Nigeria is largely democratic, but I think Buhari has a lot of power, and some of that 397.3 billion in GDP for Nigeria is at least at his disposal. So, moving to the quotes, I gave you the first one. A flawed democracy is worse than no democracy at all. That was sort of his reasoning for engaging in a coup. I take full responsibility for all my actions as military head of state. So that's, I think, a good sign of repentance, or rather maybe even the opposite. Maybe he does not repent any of his actions. But I think that's, whether he repents it or does not repent it, I think it is right that he takes full responsibility of it. Boosting education will be a direct counterbalance to Boko Haram's appeal. I think that's very true. I think, as he said in other speeches, the reason why a lot of people join Boko Haram is because it's their only way. They're already in poverty. A lot of them are illiterate, and that's their only access. A lot of people, particularly anti-Muslim individuals, which is obviously very wrong. They say, they're getting it from the Quran. Well, firstly, I think most individuals in Boko Haram have not even read the Quran, so I don't think that's a safe, valid argument. I think it's mostly the cause of lack of education. As far as the Constitution allows me, I will try to ensure that there is responsible and accountable governance at all levels of government in the country, for I will not have kept my own trust with the Nigerian people if I allow others to abuse theirs under my watch. So I think this last quote, I think, is evidencing that he may have done bad things in his past. I think his the bill he passed that allowed for him to persecute individuals who thought against the government was obviously wrong. I think a coup was wrong. However, maybe rightfully so at the time. Maybe the coup was the only way of really gaining political control in Nigeria at the time. So I don't think if he had not done it, it's likely someone else would have. And he was not necessarily the leader going into it, but he was the leader coming out of it. So I can't fully denounce him there. But I think this lastly proves the sign that obviously he has persecuted a lot of individuals, and in his past he's persecuted over 500 businessmen, politicians. However, I think he has improved, and I think he has become a much better person. I had a dispute with someone, an intellectual friend of mine, and they said the problem with this politician is that they always change their mind, which I think obviously it's not good to flip-flop at all, but I think one of the best signs of a good leader is the ability to change their mind and the ability to see other sides of an argument. Otherwise, you're just an ideologue if you just prescribe to the same beliefs. Like, you're right-wing, you believe everything that's right-wing. You're left-wing, you believe that everything's left-wing. I think that's wrong, and I think the best evidence of a good leader is the ability to change. And I think that's what this leader has done. I don't think you can say he has undoubtedly done some wrong things, but I think he's undoubtedly done some good things, and I think he has become a better person. Can we call him a good person overall or a bad person overall? I don't know, that's your decision, but I definitely think he is a better person than he had been, and that's why he has been democratically elected. So as for the symbols, here is the symbol of the Nigerian army, which is very important to him, led to his ultimate control. This is the symbol of the U.S. War Academy that he attended in Pennsylvania. This is the symbol of the government of Nigeria, or the seal of the president of Nigeria. Lastly, the population of Nigeria, once again, is 159.9 million, which is absolutely massive, with a smaller GDP for the population of 397.3 billion, which puts them in 10th place overall, in an area of 923,768 kilometers squared. So Nigeria is a much larger country than a lot of people believe, just because if you look at most maps, when you look at it, they have to expand the northern regions just to fit a square, for example, whereas the southern, as you reach more to the equator, it's more accurate. So it's a pretty large country, but not too huge. But it's really the population that hits super high. So nonetheless, we'll talk a little bit more about Buhari in the comparison. Without further ado, we will continue to Alberto Fernandez. So Alberto Fernandez is an Argentine lawyer, previously a professor as well, politician, and president of Argentina since 2019. So just recently came into power. He is a member of the Justicialist Party, which follows Peronism, which is a Peronism party based on the ideals of Son Peron, a previous president of Argentina, and it's defined by nationalism, liberalism, and populism. So a little bit more left-leaning than some of the other parties, but they've had quite a lot of success in that 10 out of the 13 elections in which the party was allowed to have run, they have won. So they've been a very successful party. He was chief cabinet minister during the entirety of Nestor Kirchner's presidency. However, Nestor Kirchner refused his second term so his wife could run, and he also served during the Fernandez also served during the early months of Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, the wife of Nestor Kirchner, in her presidency as well. In 2019, he won the election with 48% of the votes, beating the incumbent President Mauricio Macri in the general elections. So, without further ado, we'll continue into the early life, and we'll talk a bit more about his presidency and once again his specific rise to power. So he was born in Buenos Aires, which is the largest city and the capital of Argentina. He is the son of Celia Perez, who is the sister of the personal photographer of Juan Perón. So once again, Juan Perón had the philosophy behind the Justicialist Party and the sort of more left-leaning, but a very powerful and populist individual. And his mother was mother's sister, so his aunt was personal photographer to this individual. So not quite as close as we could see with, for example, Vladimir Putin, where his father was the personal chef to Lenin, but nonetheless he had at least, I think, had somewhat close interactions with this powerful individual. His father he actually barely knew. However, his mother had a second husband who was Judge Juan Carlos Pelagio, who was son of a senator of the Radical Civil Union. So his real father he never really knew, but or vaguely knew, or I guess even to some extent wanted to distance himself with. However, his mother's or his stepfather was a powerful judge coming from a powerful political family. So very much pretty good and pretty, at least not necessarily good, but a good upbringing if one wants to rise in terms of politics in Argentina. He attended law school at the University of Buenos Aires. He graduated at 24 years old and became professor of criminal law. The University of Buenos Aires is probably considered the number one university in Argentina. There are other universities that one might dispute might be better for certain faculties. However, this one, studying law, would have been a great fit for Fernandez, as it was in the capital and generally considered to be the top rated. He entered public service as an advisor to the Democratic Council of Buenos Aires and the Argentine Chamber of Deputies, so starting in politics very early at just 25 years old. Became deputy director of legal affairs of the economy ministry, and he was actually the chief negotiator in the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, in the Uruguay round. So not only was he sophisticated and had a lot of ability with respect to law, being such a law professor at such a young age, he also proved himself quite strong in terms of economics and international trade. In 1989 to 1982, starting when he was 30 years old to 33 years old, he was nominated by the newly elected President Carlos Menem to serve as National Superintendent for Insurance. So, and he also was president of the Latin American Insurance Managers Association, and he even co-founded the Insurance Managers International Association. So, not only was he good at international trade, but he was also very, very educated in terms of insurance. Insurance has a bit more of an overlap with the law, one may say, but I think insurance is generally considered to be quite a quantitative sector of finance. As you set the insurance rate or just measure the payout rate correctly, and you just let it run essentially after that. Sometimes you do have to do some forecasting, a little bit of ingenuity. However, it seems as though Fernandez had almost just as great of an ability in terms of insurance, international trade, as he did in law. And similarly, once again, similar to Buhari, he was chosen by the president, Carlos Menem, to have this role. So he was also very good at pleasing his superiors, or his superiors at least admired him. He also advised for the trade bloc Mercosur on insurance law, and he also served some private health services companies in the private sector. In 1992, he was elected one of 10 outstanding young people in Argentina. So one of the top people under 40. He was 33 at the time. He also received the Millennium Award as one of the nation's best businessmen of the century. So obviously a very, very achievement-oriented individual at a very, very young age. Pretty young. 33 is quite young. But most of his achievements were before the age of 30, and he only really achieved full recognition as one of the top 10 individuals in Argentina. He became, at this time, also close friends with former Buenos Aires governor Eduardo Derhole, who also became president in 2002 to 2003. So it seems as though pretty much every important president he at least met, or his mother's sister knew, or he had really close relationships with all of these individuals. And it was like almost like he was being seasoned to ultimately attain the role. In 2000, when he was 41 years old, he joined the Buenos Aires City Legislature, by the recommendation of the economy minister Domingo Cabello. However, in 2002 or 2003, when he was 45 years old, also at this time, he also married Morella Lucchete, and they have a son together. They, like Buhari, ultimately divorced as well. But he gave up this role in the city legislature to become a chief of cabinet of ministers during Nestor Kirchner's wife, Cristina Kirchner's election. He was named head of the Justicialist Party of Buenos Aires in 2003 as well. And during this time, however, he sort of minimized his involvement in the 2009 Front for Victory Congress campaign. So sort of with, I guess, not completely a parallel to Buhari, but closer to Buhari's military tactics. He was sort of he could have pushed during the Congress elections in 2009, but he sort of wanted to wait. He decided he'd wait until the 2011 elections, but instead of running himself, he changed his mind and supported Cristina Kirchner instead for her second term. So once again, sort of like guerrilla tactics, just kind of holding out and not jumping the gun too early. In the 2015 campaign, he was a campaign manager for Sergio Massa, who was actually from a differing party, the Front de Todas. Also in 2015, he had a divorce and he has a new domestic partner, who's an actress, Fabiole Fabe. She has Fabes. She's a very famous Argentinian actress. In the 2019 elections, however, so it was interesting that he actually went across party lines to support a different candidate during the 2015 elections. However, finally in the 2019 elections, just recently, Cristina said that who she had previously been president, she said that she would serve as vice president and let Alberto Fernandez become president. So I think this is kind of a testament to his loyalty. You know, he chose not to run in 2011 to support her instead, and he served as chief cabinet secretary for her and for her husband's entire term. So a lot of loyalty to her and her husband. So finally, in 2019, she says she would be VP and he could be president. And similarly, there was also questions they might not win. Sergio Massa from the Front de Todas, who he had previously campaigned for, also said he would align himself with him. So ultimately, very likely that they would win. In the primaries, he won 47.7% of the votes, which would be sufficient to beat Mauricio Marci. So Mauricio Marci beat Cristina Kirchner as she attempted to run for her third election. And however, after this great success in the primaries, Alberto Fernandez said that he would help Mauricio Marci in completing his term, as to help the whole country, but he was ready to take it. And Marci sort of accepted this and said, okay, I'll work with Fernandez because Fernandez will probably win. And so that also occurred. His by ultimate vote turnout was 48.1%, even higher, probably for agreeing to work with his competitor. And he won almost he won that day. And his objective was to bring calm to the economy and avoid debt defaults, because Argentina had accumulated a lot of debt, particularly 100 billion into private debt holders and 45 billion from the International Monetary Fund. So with respect to his specific presidency, it hasn't been too long, however, and a lot of it has been marked with COVID. However, he is focused on social solidarity and productive recovery bill, which involves tax hikes on foreign currency purchases. That's to keep investment in currency within the country, which will slow down deflation, as well as tax hikes on um, agricultural imports and promoting agricultural exports, as well as increased taxes on wealth and car sales as well. So sort of taxing, once again, the upper class. And that's sort of a market feature of the Judicialist Party, where it is populist and for labor centered. So those who own more cars will pay more tax. Those who have more wealth will do so. And importing goods is also more expensive. But also exporting goods, agricultural goods, are also taxed more heavily. The joke was, and I imagine it's even more so true under this government, was that for a time, and it was better to convert your currency into cattle and then carry your cattle across the Argentinian border than it was to take your profits directly out of Argentina. So at that time, it was very difficult to invest outside of the country, whereas if you just bought cattle and moved it across the border, it would save you a lot of money in terms of tariffs. However, he has also increased the tariffs on exports, so once again making it more and more difficult. So Argentina is actually very interesting because it's, I think, besides Brazil, which is the largest by area, it's probably got the most resources. Venezuela has a lot of oil, but their government is rather corrupt, so it's very difficult for them to extract it. But Argentina is a very, very resource-rich country, and one of the few exceptions is cattle is easy to export. But and Argentina has a lot of opportunities to become a real world player. Right now they're sitting at 11th spot, but I think that'll soon rise. But I don't think necessarily the taxation and hurting international trade is the way to do it. He also, on the flip side, has tax incentives for production within the country. He gave food cards to 2 million of the poorest families, which is obviously a great way to render some votes. That's why, representative of him and his predecessors and the Judicialist Party, giving 2 million food stamps is obviously a way to win 2 million votes out of a population of 44.5 million people. Is a pretty effective measure. But is it sustainable? Probably not. And also, one of the main things he's been focusing on, as mentioned earlier, is renegotiation on the terms of some of the Argentina's large debt figure, where they have 100 billion in debt from private holders and 45 billion from the International Monetary Fund. So 145 billion on a GDP of 519.6 billion. That's a lot of debt for a country like this. So in terms of the quotes, we have when you affect consumption, production falls, and when production falls, unemployment falls, and when unemployment rises, it affects poverty. So once again, I think this is just nice, I think it's rather intuitive, but I think it's just evidence of his great speech abilities, but also his understanding of economics and his real economic focus. It makes no sense to have oil if to get it out, you have to let the multinationals come and take it. So this has been something he's taken a very tough stance on. He doesn't want the multinational corporations coming in and affecting their oil. So, and once again, a little bit more of a nationalist policy and sort of anti-free trade, which has been marketed of his government and his predecessors. We are not socialists. We are Peronists. We are pragmatic. So once again, Juan Perón, the founder of the Judicialist philosophy. But I think this is I put this down here because I think this is an important rhetoric. I think most people think socialism is de facto bad. Obviously communism is bad, and too far is always bad. But a little bit of socialism is not bad, and I think a little bit of socialism could help them improve their economy. The actual best argument against or in favor of socialism I heard from a very famous conservative thinker, that being Ayn Rand, in particularly Atlas Shrugged. In Ayn Rand, the looters are the people who are essentially you could call them the communists, who are taking the money from the corporations. And whenever the corporations complain, the looters say they're being antisocial. which is interesting that I notice no one really uses this sort of rhetoric. It seems like if anyone wants to mention socialism, they are sort of denounced. Bernie Sanders was running and he considered himself a socialist, which I think to consider oneself wholly a socialist or wholly a capitalist, I think both are wrong. You should have some capitalism, some socialism. But nonetheless, a really good defense for the socialism is to call the capitalists antisocial. So I think that's just to fight fire with fire, because socialism has already become a negative term. So to apply a negative name to capitalism is to call it antisocial. But nonetheless, he is more left leaning, and perhaps he's gone too far because their economy is not performing as well as it could. If I finish my term and have inflation down to a single digit, I will be very happy. That's 4 years of hard work. So that's just, once again, him trying to, as mentioned, maintain investment within his own currency, because a lot of people are purchasing currency from other countries, namely particularly Brazil. So maintaining circulation of the currency in Argentina would be one way of addressing inflation, because inflation is essentially a dollar's worth less, or less purchasing power, because the currency is worth less. So yeah, I guess here are the symbols. Here's the symbol of Buenos Aires on the top right. Here's the symbol of Buenos Aires University. Here's the symbol of the Judicialist Party, which follow Peronian philosophies. And here's the flag of the president of Argentina. Here's the Argentinian flag. The population of Argentina is 44.5 million. So much less than that of Nigeria. So Nigeria has almost 3 times, or maybe even more, because the censuses are difficult, over 3 times the population. However, the GDP of Argentina is 519.6 billion, and the GDP of Nigeria is 397.3 billion. So Argentina is a pretty resource-rich nation, but nonetheless, their GDP hits much higher, especially in terms of per capita. And the area of Argentina, surprisingly, is much bigger at 2.78 million kilometers squared, whereas the area of Nigeria is 923,768, with a much larger population. So overall, with the comparison, once again, the style of these videos is in the style of Plutarch, where they take one great leader from Rome and one great leader from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Here we're taking the great leaders from these 2 respective countries. The comparison would be, firstly, I think that money talks, to sort of sum it up. But I think most of all of their failures, I think Buhari, the reason why his original coup failed was because he did not address economic concerns enough. He became president again by reinventing himself as one who is very financially focused, or one who focuses much on in terms of the economy. Similarly, Fernandez, although he has a legal background and was even a legal professor, he really came into power through focusing on the economy. And I think this makes sense for both these countries, because both these countries, one of the main reasons why they are not, I think both of these countries have the power to even be the top countries in the world. Nigeria, with such a large population, could be definitely the leader in Africa. Argentina, Brazil is obviously a big player, but Argentina you might consider them to have better resources. They have the capacity to be very, very powerful as well, but both of their economies are just really hurting, I think, for different reasons. In Nigeria, it's mostly because of history of war and lack of infrastructure, whereas Argentina is, I would say, a little bit too much of socialist policies. But some of it is necessary. For example, the 2 million food stamps that they gave out, there are starving people in Argentina, and that's more important than just fixing up the economy. And it could be worse. They're 10th or 11th spot, which is rather still pretty good. The next one, I think, is loyalty. I think that Buhari was very, very loyal within the military. That's why he supported previous coups, and that's why he rose through the ranks so well. He never betrayed anyone. In fact, you could even say he got betrayed. But also, I think he's loyal to his country, even after he was imprisoned by his by previous governments. After he had lost multiple elections, he just stayed loyal to the country, stayed loyal to the army, and that's very indicative there. Whereas in terms of Fernandez, he was very loyal to the Kirchners, both husband and wife. He supported both of their governments. He's been quite loyal to the Judicialist Party, and even when he went to support the Mauricio Marci from the opposing party, I think Mauricio, when he saw that Fernandez was willing to go across party lines and support him, Fernandez is really one that is loyal and could be trusted, and ultimately helped him in winning his election. So very, very loyal there. In terms of some differences, obviously, I think they both actually had a pretty I think in Nigeria, being son of a chieftain, although 23rd son did not render them a lot, his social standing was not quite comparable to that of Fernandez, whereas Fernandez had close ties with an aunt who was personal photographer of president. He got to meet all the presidential leaders, whereas Buhari sort of had to do it more through climbing through the military ranks. However, both attained a lot of great successes throughout their life, one in the military and one in the business and private sectors. So both were very, Fernandez was one of 10 outstanding young people in Argentina. So I think both of these individuals really succeeded in their pre-political craft, and their pre-political craft just happened to carry over very, very well to ultimately presidency. Lastly, I'd like to compare them both to Fabius Maximus Veracruz, as mentioned earlier, the Conctator, the founder of guerrilla warfare. Obviously, guerrilla warfare has existed for a very long time, but it really was fully recognized in Fabius Maximus's wars against Hannibal. And I think both of these, firstly, Buhari's is probably more evidenced through his actual warfare, which is directly, I think, related to that of Fabius Maximus. However, both of their styles, or I think Fernandez's political style, could be representative of Fabius Maximus too, in that, he thought about running in the 2011 elections, but he chose not to, and to support Christina Kirchner, and he waited. And then he waited again, supporting her again, and then he got certain political ties, and then he ultimately attacked when the time was right. So I think both of these people could be called conctators, or conctator in Latin means the delayer, and I think both of these people represent these individuals. So I also recommend highly you watch that video if you're not already. So yeah, that is the president of Nigeria and Argentina respectively. I hope you enjoyed this video on Cashcroft TV. Thanks so much.